Now let us welcome our third lecturer for this morning, Dr. Layne Hartsell from Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok. He will share his insights on Sandra Mitchell's integrative pluralism. Let us welcome Dr. Hartsell. Dr. Hartsell, we cannot hear your audio, sir. Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, am I there now? I think that the prudent thing to do is always ask, can you hear me before I start, which I always do actually, except for today. Okay, you got me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Uh, well, greetings to everyone there, and thank you, Professor Ryan Mabaluk, and others, Rogelio, for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. I've been in looking over a lot of material to talk to you about today, and I had arrived when I had when Ryan had written to me, I had thought about a couple different directions. Today, as you know, that there's an epistemic crisis in the West, which means the way that we come to knowledge is not agreed upon, or at least people don't accept how we agree upon coming to knowledge, and particularly in society. But today I'm going to talk more about I'll give mention to some of the social aspects, but I'm going to kind of dive into philosophy of science. And I should say that for Dr. Rogelio, I wish I had given that lecture that you gave, because that paper that you and John wrote is just extraordinary. And I read that when it came out, and I also use it for basis for some of my work. So thank you for that lecture, and also to Jichiro-san for bringing all of that out. I'm going to go a bit more precise into science today for you, and talk about a little bit of background, the history of science, and how we kind of got to where we're at today. And then I want to talk about Sandra Mitchell's integrative pluralism, and then Peter Lake's some comments from Peter Lake. And when I get to the text, I have the text here beside me. When I get to the text, I'm going to more free associate and think with you rather than lecture. And there's a reason for that, because the information is so complex today. And you'll see what I mean when I talk about just understanding like a PCR test for COVID. How do you understand a PCR test? That was a major issue in philosophy of science 3 years ago. So let me get into, first of all, to say a few words about the natural sciences as we understand them over the last 400 years. So modern science, or natural philosophy is what they called it at the time, began, we say, with Galileo, because of the beginning of more precision in understanding nature. Now, ancient science, of course, is there. It goes back. I mean, Aristarchus of Samos postulated that exactly what Galileo found. Aristarchus said that the Earth goes around the sun, and this type of cosmology. But it was Aristotle that the society went with, and the Catholic Church held that until, of course, up through the scholastics into the 17th century. And since we're in the theology department this morning, I'll mention this history so that we can try to gain some more accurate understanding. It's not that the Catholic Church is totally wrong on everything. I mean, there's a lot of issues about religion today, but I specifically want to talk about how we come to knowledge and how we know what it is that we're looking at, or if we even can know what we're looking at. So, considering the profundity of nature and all of life, there is a process of knowledge that we go about, and anyone would recognize it. And that is, even outside of a class on theology or a class on philosophy, people would understand a certain process that we see something, we make an observation. I'm just going to give the kind of popular terms. So I see something, I see that this is going to happen after that, and basically people are explaining causation. So if I'm driving my car, then I want to avoid running a red light. a red light is actually a social construction, but the laws of physics we already intuit as creatures that we shouldn't uh, get in the way of, say, that big truck coming through the intersection. So this is a very rudimentary science, right? We're looking at the world and trying to make understandings about what's coming next based on what I'm doing. So we call that philosophy of science, of course, cause and effect. So there's a few important parts that I want to talk about when we come to understand um, the world through philosophy of science. The first is the reliance on the senses. So the sense data that's coming in from the sensory apparatus, we could say, or the sensory faculties. Uh, we start to get a kind of a holistic view of the world, and we could call it a cosmological view. You know, how do we fit into the world and all of that? We think, or I think, that this is a fundamental capacity or faculty of the human being to try to understand the world. And I think that you can watch when a baby starts to become a little more conscious when they're first born. Of course, they're entirely dependent, but when a baby starts to be able to crawl, it starts to explore, and it will be into everything eventually. So I think that the motivation and the exploratory capacity are innate. They're natural, I guess you could say. We call it innate. So the senses are the first aspect of science. It's not an inner knowledge. So I don't meditate and come to scientific knowledge because it has to be verified through the senses with other people. The second is verification with others. So that's the next one. So when around, I think it was about 1610, when Galileo he had developed the telescope, right? So basically they took the microscope and turned it around and pointed it outwards. And he had seen Jupiter, which they could see Jupiter at the time with the scopes. There were these little dots, because Jupiter is very big, right? There are these little dots that he could see on Jupiter. And each night he would stay up and watch this planet. They called these things stars at the time. And these little things would go across it, which he called the Medicean stars. He called these little things stars. He was looking at Jupiter's moons. And he would come back the next night and he would see that some of the little dots had moved and others had disappeared. And so this kind of, this was perplexing to him, of course. And after another week or whatever it was, in a month, he saw the dots come around on the other side. And so basically he's looking at a flat screen, right, through the telescope. But you see like these other dots coming here and these other dots moving, and they're moving across. So he thought that probably there's something going around that planet. Okay, so what he did was he showed other scholars at the time. Now by this time, Copernicus, 50 years before, had already posited that the Earth goes around the sun. And within Italy at this time, it was oppressive. It was a theocracy, but it wasn't like Kepler was dealing with, say, in Germany. So in Germany, total knowledge was totally shut down. In Italy, it had quite a bit of openness with the Catholic Church, and that's why we have a lot of the developments that we have today, because of this particular time in Italy. So we're talking about there around Venice and Padua. That's kind of like there on the north eastern side of Italy. And everybody, of course, knows Venice, which was kind of the center of the world at that time for this side of the world. So Galileo was looking at this. He showed these dots he had drawings first, and then he showed people through the telescopes. And some people, of course, thought it was interesting. They believed what he was saying. Others said that there must be artifact in the lenses, because they relied on biblical writings. So I think it's in Job, if I recall, Job or Joshua 10. It says that the earth is stationary and the universe goes around the earth and so forth. So they were relying on scripture, the scholastics. Then some of the other scholastics refused to look through the microscope or through the telescope, saying that all of truth is already revealed. This is nonsense. Okay, so you can see this today actually with climate denial and uh, some type of climate skepticism, and then people that accept climate. You can almost put it in the same terms. But over time, these as these little points started to change, what he called Medicean stars, or what we call moons of Jupiter today, uh, it was clear that through the sense data, this was being verified more and more. Okay, so over time, this was verified, over the next decade. Then he started to write the dialogues. So we're talking around like the 1620s here. And in the dialogues, he parodies, Galileo parodies the dissenters and the deniers, just like climate change today. Okay, so basically, this verification system that I'm talking about with others is foundational to scientific epistemology, which depends on the senses. Okay, so we look through the telescope. We see Saturn, for example. I say to you, do you see that little uh, disk there? And around it, it has this ring. And then you look at it, you say, yes, I see that Saturn, and it has this ring around it. Okay, we call that Saturn. All right, then we go on from there. It gets a bit more complicated here towards the end of the talk, but I'm trying to lay out the basics. Um, the idea here is that we arrive at as accurate of a description as possible. So when they say facts don't convince people, what is this popular saying? Facts don't convince people. Just ignore that kind of saying. That kind of saying is propaganda to distract away from how we actually do science, or how a jury would come to understand what is the most accurate description of the crime. Okay, so it's an explanatory power that we talk about, not facts and like one fact convincing everybody of something. Okay, the only way that a fact could convince people of something is if they already knew the body of knowledge. So it would be true. What's that? It would be true that if I give a fact, like say a superstorm hits Asheville, and the scientists at NOAA and in Boulder, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, if they say this is a storm like we've never seen before, okay, now we can say that fact, that particular storm is an example of climate change. Okay. All right. So now the third is a bit, so I went from the sense data, which is the brute force of information coming into us, and that comes in as data. And then as innately we start to form information. How is that information important? So for example, if I see that it's 80 or I'm sorry, 35 degrees Celsius outside, that's just a number, that's just data. But when I put it into information about its effects on our body, now we're starting to get into information and knowledge. And then wisdom would be how to apply information. So when we go from data to verification, and then there's a third aspect to science that becomes more social. Science is non-authoritarian, or non-authority based. So again, like I said, if I meditate and I come up with some kind of truth about the world, uh, it still has to be verified through the senses with other people before it would be a scientific fact. So when people speak of the science of yoga or the science of, I don't know, Islam or whatever, I think that those could be ignored. I think that what people are doing is they're trying to legitimize inner experience using scientific uh, 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 information. And I think that I think that's totally unnecessary. If I argue from a religious standpoint, I don't need to use sensory data necessarily. So I think that when people are using the scientific terms, say in postmodernism or Islam or whatever, I think that they're engaging in propaganda and some kind of posturing in society. I think that so when we go with non-authority, it means it's not coming from just me. It's coming from a pluralistic view. So I'm getting into more of this integrative pluralism now. So what happened with Galileo? Well, he first of all in the dialogues there in the 1620s, he criticized. He goes first of all he goes after the Pythagoreans. So the Pythagoreans were, ancient cult. They were doing science and mathematics, and they thought that, like they think that everything is formulas. The entire, all of nature is mathematics, like actually objectively so. And they also they had kind of strange ideas and, this kind of thing. But I think that we should have strange ideas because that kind of pushes the limits of our current understanding. But anyway, he goes after the Pythagoreans, and then he turns his satire towards the scholastics and the periclerics of today, we would say, like Fairbrand. Uh, so he goes after them, and he basically says that uh, he kind of takes some shots at the Pope, who actually he knew through the family, and then other scholastics. And this was like hitting a hornet's nest with a stick. So now this whole thing blows up, and by later in the decade and so forth, he's in big trouble. I'm glad that that doesn't happen today because the things I'm saying right now would be illegal. I do want to add again that the theocracy at that time wasn't bad, but science when scientific truth enters into society and it's countered, now scientific society has to become anti-authoritarian. So it's non-authoritarian just with taking in the information and then verification. Then it becomes anti-authoritarian when it's confronted with authority that says, for example, my way is the highway because this is the facts of the world today. And and so what I'm talking about here is how you have, say, like one company X is claiming to be the media of the world, and President Trump is giving the truth. I think that this is a very dangerous situation, but I don't want to go too far into society. I just want to give you some examples. Okay, so now we get into since we have a system that is way for trying to find the truth or giving an accurate representation of what we see around us. Um, uh, what we try to do is is look at the explanatory power, and so here is where a system of experts has to come in. I mean, there's a lot of negative talk about experts today, but I think what they mean by and a lot of populist talk, right? I think what they are actually getting at is the co-optation we call regulatory capture in global justice is called regulatory capture. But what the populists are saying is that the political process is deforming science information. Okay, so Anthony Fauci is very bad because he's forcing everybody to take vaccines, and the vaccines are untested. Well, the forcing people to take vaccines, I was totally against. That's a social aspect. Developing these vaccines on the other side is more of a pure science aspect. Okay, so this kind of problem that I'm describing in the West, especially. I'm not sure exactly in Asia because I don't know the languages too much as well, and I haven't heard the descriptions. But in the West, there's an epistemic crisis, and the epistemic crisis is based on these criterion that I've already given you for how we come to understand the world together. Now, if you want to understand the world as an inner from an inner perspective, this is fine because we have freedom of religion. But the difference is that in public, that perspective, if it's religious or inner, can be criticized and evaluated. And if we're going to make policy, it should be democratic, coming from the demos and not from just one person. Um, the problem at hand is that there's a framing that folks are caught in that rejects the senses on one hand. So some people just reject the sense data and go with biblical authority, or they go with authority and reject factual information as a means for a power grab. And I would assert that most of the time it's probably the second, that there's a rejection of the factual information that we have, say climate science, or they just say it's co-opted by big oil, and therefore the science isn't any good. It could be, but not. Science is very hard to warp, but it is affected by the big corporations. And I already told you that facts don't convince people, which everybody knows, but that's of course not the right framework when explanatory power is the measure. So Galileo's presentation of the facts to the scholastics and to other people had to go by this same kind of democratic deliberation from other people. Now, what was happening at that time was interesting, though, because they also had the printing press. So Galileo had access to the latest technology because Venice was a center of the world, a center, because also China and India were the real centers. But Venice was a center of the world. It had publishing, it had culture, center of power, an oligarchy that worked fairly well. What they were able to do is they could copy all of his notes and also the telescope, and they could get this out into the society so other people could look at it. Other people also could read the text that he was writing. So what happens was you have this massive distributed system of verification that happened. Now, what does this sound like today? Well, blockchain and peer-to-peer systems and open source. The exact similar kind of thing is happening right now. But at that time, of course, people were walking about and having to. It was a bit slow compared to what we have today. Okay, aside from this third point concerning science and society, taking up those first 2 points about how we come to knowledge, my perspective is integralist, but a integral radical openness, and not say Kuhn's idea that science is immature, and that's why we see pluralism. So Kuhn would say that the reason we see such different ideas in science, even with the experts, is because science is immature. From the pluralistic scientific aspect with Sandra Mitchell, she says no, that the complexity that we see is because there's so much. As you know, I mean, the explosion of information over the past, I don't know. I mean, I guess the digital age started to come on in the 70s, but let's say the digital age really was here by the 1980s, because we were using ARPANET in the labs and so forth in research in the 80s and 90s, and then came the social aspect. So let's say the digital age is like 40 or 50 years. During this time is this explosion of information, and the way it's so complex that we can't possibly get to all the information. Now we can use AI today to say, give AI parameters and go in to put information together for us, and that's the way we're going to have to deal with so much information. So going from Lake, he asked, what is it that counts as a scientific explanation today? And that's kind of foundational to all that I've been saying. So the cause and effect relationship that I was telling you about, that's accepted. Okay, it might be both Galileo and Newton. I mean, they pointed out that nature was beyond us, and they already recognized that nature was beyond us. In the Catholic tradition, they recognize God as beyond us. How how it is that nature and God, or if they're the same thing, if you want to call it that, since we're in a theology department, how it is that those get co-opted into specific power structures ought to be, studied and talked about a lot in public today, given the certain circumstances. But they, if these are beyond us, it's really going to be hard next or impossible to grasp. But for practical purposes, I think there is some kind of uniformity in nature, um, such that science works. Okay, so when I was in the emergency room when I was very young, like 2022, uh, a patient came in. I was in the emergency room there. A patient came in and it was in a coma, and the nurse said, "Layne, come and watch this." And I didn't know what the diagnosis was. I just saw the person laying there. So the nurse walked over with, I guess it's dextrose. And I can't remember now. It's been 40 years ago. It was, I guess it was dextrose. And she began to slowly put it into the IV. And within a few minutes, the person's eyes opened up, and they looked as if nothing had happened to them. It was like an automaton almost. And I thought, my God, this even though I did even at that time, I didn't think mechanics was a very good model because I had read Heisenberg and all of these people before. But I did see this kind of mechanical aspect of chemistry work. And what had happened is that sometimes people will take an extra dose of their insulin when they have diabetes. And if you take too much, it will put you into insulin shock and you go into a coma. And let's see, yes, it takes too much of your blood sugar out of your system and you go into a form of shock. And then they have to take you into the emergency room and give you dextrose and wake you up. I'm not speaking medically here. I'm saying that I think that's what's happening. I have the right picture anyway. Um, you'll see other things like this. So there's chemistry, but there's also just the brute nature of the fact that, like, say I have this tablet, and I know that uh, for myself, I shouldn't drop it because there, we perceive a uniformity in nature, and if this drops, then well, it's probably going to break. We don't know that. So if we want to go with David Hume, he said, well, nature is so complex, we don't know if the what laws are going to change in the next moment. But I think for practical purposes, I shouldn't drop my tablet, neither should you. And we tell children, to be careful with their tablets because they will break if they drop them. But if the child were to actually say to us in Humean fashion, but you don't know what's going to happen in the next moment, then they got us. Okay, so that's kind of the situation that we're dealing with. And so instead of Humean skepticism, today we go with probability. So the the scientific project, which thought that everything could be described with mathematics and with mechanics. Mechanics means this thing pushes that thing, so things connected. That went out the window almost immediately with Galileo in the dialogues, and then with Newton. Newton said we're like children sitting on the seashore. We can see the sand and the waves in front of us, but as far as the vast ocean, that's beyond us. Newton took a radical openness when it came to reality, and I suggest this too. Maybe if you want to call it naturalistic mysticism or uh, theological mysticism or whatever people want to go with, I think that that's probably actually the case. I think that the fact that if human beings actually think they know something, besides the fact we have tremendous technology enough to destroy cities and so forth, all the bad stuff, uh, I think that it when we hear this, we get into all the anthropocentric and the hubris and war against nature and all that kind of thing. So in the uh, we have Newton Galileo already saying that the mechanical model is gone out, but it still persisted up until Mach Einstein. And then when you start to have quantum mechanics, out goes the mechanical model, and the physicists today say it's spooky action at a distance. So we have spooky action at a distance, we have radical openness, we have a divine being. All of these things are grasping at what very likely we're not going to know, in my opinion. So since science can't speak with absolutes, it comes with relative levels of assuredness. And that's where we get into Sandra Mitchell's work, that as this scientific project has been scaled back from a Pythagorean mathematics to Galileo's The Book of Nature is written in mathematics. Then he recognized that nature's beyond us, to Newton. And then Descartes comes the duality, and all this mechanics came back. And then Mach and Einstein eliminated it. So the mechanical model's been gone for 140 years. The fact that the postmodernists seem to pick up on this and keep harping on it was really a big mystery to me, and I think to a lot of philosophers of science. But anyway, I want to get away from that part and look at this kind of world of cause and effect and how we come to understand what's happening. So, for example, if I say, how do we understand a PCR test to be positive or negative? And this is actually a paper that was out 3 years ago. So scientists were able to identify the virus within just well, I mean, they had it almost immediately within a week, and then maybe like a couple of 2 weeks, we could actually see what this thing looked like. So you have this little round virus, you have all these little protein, things on the outside of it. It looks like a crown, so they call it coronavirus. And how do we use all of these sophisticated technologies? Because now we're not just dealing with the brute senses looking at nature or looking through a telescope, a technology. Now we're looking at the world and gaining data through machines with other machines and other machines and so forth. But that we're getting data from nature. Infinitely complex to understand science today. So the traditional philosophy of science. So I'm going to go with Leck here, Peter Leck. The traditional philosophy of science is aimed to put forth logical analyses of the premises of science. Okay, so now we're going into philosophy of science, not just science, which what I was talking about. The philosophy of science is looking at the premises of science, what is foundational to science, and the logical analysis of the syntax of the scientific concepts. So we look at linguistics, look at the assumptions of science, and you start to, when you get into science as philosophy, and you start looking at the foundations, it starts to look like what Karl Popper said is not as fixed and stable as people think. Karl Popper said that it's like driving pylons down into a swamp and building your house on top of the pylons. It's still moving and shifting about, albeit I still think that there's as I said, with the dextrose injection and the person waking up, I think that there's some uniformity, and I would certainly recommend going to the emergency room if getting injured. So the object of science, of course, is the world, the sense data coming in, and there is a model here that we take a model that there is a physical world out there, material monism, if you want to call it, that is going on, and again, even Newton recognized this, and he was criticized by Leibniz for being like a spiritualist or a mystic, and Newton was saying that I don't see a physical world, but the ghost is still there. the spirit is still there, but I don't see a physical world actually. But for science, we accept that there's a physical world there, and that there's a uniformity that we can verify between each other. So the one example is the Henle-Conch postulate. So going into biology, so getting away from physics and that kind of thing, in the postulates for understanding a disease, an organism, and I'm going to have to quote from him here. The organism must be found in all animals suffering from the disease, but not in healthy animals. So, you see healthy animals, okay, they don't have the disease. These animals that are suffering, they have the disease. Now we're talking like 150 years ago here, 150 years, yeah. The organism must be isolated from the diseased animal and grown in a pure culture. Okay, so we can see this thing under a microscope and so on. The cultured organism should cause the disease when introduced into a healthy animal. Okay, so now we take this, we make a vial of this thing and we inject it into this other animal to see if they get the disease. That doesn't always work, of course. And the next one is the organism must be re-isolated from this other animal. So this was very rudimentary microbiology coming about in the scientific revolution, of course, modern science. And if such postulates that we make here are considered to be general criteria, then we have cause and effect in biomedical sciences. The causation is unlikely if now this is where you get into a problem, because what if that animal has natural resistance which they didn't know about? Now you have a cause and effect problem. But he says that acknowledging overly stringent criteria for causation minimize the chance of identifying the causes of the disease. So this British medical, so we have to, at this point, we rely on the statisticians, the medical statisticians. So the British statistician Austin Bradford, in 1897 to 1991, he lived. He outlined some tenable minimal conditions that can help to establish causal relationship between two entities. So basically, from code, then we start to get more specific and more precise. And as we get more precise, it's in this complexity that I argue that we start to get this kind of unknowing, but that's different than the radical openness that's even further out. I hope you can understand that from what I argued earlier. Now, let's take, for example, cigarette smoking and what's the specific causal factor for, say, cancer coming from cigarettes. So you get a disease such as emphysema or lung cancer, and there are specific criterion, and you can write these down if you want to in your notebooks. The strength of association. So now it's not just this causes that, it has to be the strength of association. Again, the scientific project is being scaled back so that we can understand better precision, if that helps. So the stronger the association, the less likely the relationship is due to chance or confounding variables. So if you have a strong argument, if you have a strong association, then most likely the excess variables are not influencing and that you actually have what you're looking at. The next one is consistency of observed association. It's observed by different people, different places, and different times. Specificity is the association is limited to specific people, sites, and types of disease. And if there's no association between the exposure and other modes of dying or getting sick, then the relationship supports causation. There's 5 more. Temporality. The exposure of interest must precede the outcome by a period of time consistent with any proposed biological mechanism. So basically, you can't have something, disease occurring here and infection occurring later in time. There's temporality going on. And that's actually, temporality is a major device used in the courts to figure out what happened. So what they will say to the person who's a suspect is, where were you on the night of, okay, where were you on the night of October 1st at 2 a.m.? Okay. And then you start going through this kind of process to find out, if that person could have even been in the area at the certain time. Biological gradient, there's a gradient of risk associated with the degree of exposure, so dose response relationship. Biological plausibility, there's a known or postulated mechanism by which the exposure might reasonably alter the risk of developing the disease. And then coherence. The observed data should not conflict with known facts about natural history and the biology of the disease. Now, I want to make a comment here on coherence. Coherence is actually there's a in philosophy of science, say with Hilary Putnam, he recognized that they had this kind of fact value duality. You can't get facts and values intertwined. You can't derive facts and values from each other. But actually, it's a bit more complicated. So Hilary Putnam said they're entangled. Well, instead of facts and values being all jumbled together or totally separate and never coming together, what we try to do, again, scaling back the scientific project, is we try to untangle this entanglement between facts and values. So I'll give you an example here. When physicists say that something is coherent, that's a value judgment based on our innate abilities to make coherence of the world. So this is an example where we have to be careful that mysticism and irrationality doesn't come into the sciences through something like the issue of coherence. And so if I say coherence is a value statement, then other people say, okay, well, it's all relative, for example. This is a gross error. And I think that Bruno Latour makes some very serious errors, around these kinds of issues in postmodernism. So experiment. The next point is experiment.
Yeah, no
So
problem.
we want to be careful with understanding the what coherence means. And when we say something's coherent, it makes sense, okay? But to say something is coherent, such as in physics, this aspect is a value statement, okay? Understand? And then finally, the last two is you have experiment, which is the strongest support for causation is obtained through controlled experiments. So you have clinical trials, you have intervention studies, and animal experiments. So we start with animals, with experiments on pharmaceutical compounds, for example, and then that moves up into studies. You see, like say, pandemic or epidemic happening, and then the clinical trials are very rigorous. So you start out with healthy individuals, right, by giving them the medicine, and you start going up on titration of doses. Then you go into stage, they have different stages of these clinical trials before they get to sick people. Okay, so it's a highly rigorous system, and it's one that I argue that we should not allow to be weakened. This should be strengthened. It should be through democratic process, as I've argued in the past. Now, analogy is the final point that I want you to remember, is that in some cases it's fair to judge cause effect relationships just by analogy. So let's say, for example, with the effects of thalidomide and rubella before us, it is fair to accept slighter but similar evidence with other drug and other viral disease in pregnancy. So when you have the effects from this disease or this chemical on pregnancy or on the fetus, you can find analogies and not just cause and effect. So we scale the project of science back even further, that sometimes we just can go with analogy of something being at the same time and by association coming right after another, or even at the same time, to try to make decisions. So I think you can see how complicated that can get. Now that I've got you into the complication, into the complexity, I want to finish with Sandra Mitchell's integrative pluralism. So as I said, I'm an integralist when it comes to this, not an integralist in the sense of there's a kind of popular faddish, like a techno optimism, integralism, comes from some theorists and thinkers in Colorado, but the pluralism I'm talking about is radical openness and the integrative pluralism with looking at the complexity of actually what's going on. So the fact of pluralism in science is no surprise, of course, right? Uh, and I hope everybody understands pluralism because you all are in theology. So there's a couple things. There's a multiplicity of models, there's theoretical approaches, and there's many different explanations. Now, what do? I mean, you have to deal with the real world. You have to deal with the broken legs. You have to deal with people may have depression or schizophrenia. People may have kidney disease. You can't just sit around and do philosophy or even theology all day and you have to act, right? So how is it that we're going to best act? And I propose that I rely on this process that I've given to you. And then in philosophy of science, we understanding the complexity of what's going on. So Mitchell says that if science is representing and explaining the structure of one world, again, we accept this as a model. Why is there such a diversity of representations and explanations in some domains? So the response from Kuhn was that science is immature, which I don't think it is. I think that it just isn't going to be able to give you full information. Yet history shows us that many sciences never exhibit a diminution in the multiplicity of theories, models, and explanations. In other words, as we go along, we're not getting less and less theories and models as if getting closer to the truth. We're getting more. We're getting more information, more knowledge, and things are not looking any less complex. This is a problem. Um, so the diversity of views found in contemporary science is not such an embarrassment or a sign of failure, but the product of scientists doing what they do to produce science. So pluralism reflects complexity. And so now we say, well, what kind of pluralism and what type of complexity do we want to have? The integrative model, I think, is the best way to look at it. And there's a couple ways to go. And so you have, Kircher and Cartwright and, Lakatos and Fairbrand, all of these different models that came about. And there was one thing that was good about postmodernism is it did bring out a major discussion in the complexity of science, although I thought that the conclusions were wrong. So you have, the wave and particle theories of light. You've got Darwinian and Lamarckian theories of inheritance and so on. So if you look at Karl Popper, you take that tradition, and they would say that the desirability of maintaining a number of competing research programs or theories is done in order to hasten the progress of science. That argument is that there's a competition going on between alternative accounts of the same set of phenomena. So you have these scientists looking at the phenomena and they get at different accounts, and these other scientists looking at the same phenomena and describing it in a different way. Now, here's a problem. Now, the supposition that I have or that we have is that if you bring these viewpoints together and you try to integrate them to see what's going on, then you can eliminate certain aspects that turn out to be inaccurate, and you can increase the power of the explanation. So competition would be the most severe environment, and that kind of area has to be regulated because even though we want scientists to be free and open as possible with, say, funding material, I personally disagree, and the Chinese had this happen. Is someone cloned a human being already? And this kind of thing, you just don't want scientists just going off into a kind of their own authority and what they're going to do. I see a child joining us today. Very nice. The empirical scrutiny has to come about with that. So you have empirical scrutiny, and then you reject which Sandra Mitchell says the offending hypothesis. you have to reject the offending hypothesis. So I just say the incorrect hypothesis, right? Uh, having a plurality of competing alternatives is supposed to increase the probability of a particularly troublesome empirical result for any hypothesis that will be exposed. Now, Philip Kitcher and Beatty uh, talk about this also. Kitcher's done tremendous work in both philosophy of science and democracy. Maintaining multiple competing theories and explanations is deemed the rational strategy to adopt for the scientific community as a whole in order to hedge its bets against empirical uncertainty. So Kitcher's a gambling man, right? He says, let's have this, this pluralism so as to hedge our bets. It kind of like this. We hedge our bets on reality, and I describe it like this. And theology is not much different. Our senses are kind of close, and Newton was right too. Our senses are kind of close in, right? And if you think of like I live in the mountains, when the fog comes to the mountains, and I look out towards the mountains, I can barely see the outline of the mountains, but in close, I can see varying from here out to the mountains, I can see varying levels of clarity. Uh, Close in, I have more clarity. 15 meters away, I have less clarity. 100 meters, and then out a kilometer, a few kilometers to the mountains, I can't see any. I think that this is a way to look at reality and realize that ultimately, whatever's beyond that mountain can't be seen. And so we hedge our bets. What we do, I think, with science, and I encourage wild speculation, as long as we say it's speculation, because if you don't, then you get into this kind of conspiracy theory, nonsense. So I encourage speculation and wild speculation, kind of reaching out into that foggy area and see if there's anything in there that we can bring in and understand. And so we hedge our bets in this kind of empirical uncertainty, and maybe we'll come up with some knowledge. And we realize what they call, or what we call, empirical or epistemological fallibility. And I think this is very key, that regardless of how arrogant and it is science is today, and how corrupted a lot of it is, fundamentally, you can always come back to epistemological fallibility. There isn't any scientist that can deny that. It's the same thing as, say, in Christianity. Um, they're driving around in a big car, and they care less about the poor. Fundamentally, in Christianity, as a social project, you can always come back to what Jesus said about the poor. Okay, so I'm using an analogy here from science. These are humbling aspects, and I'm not saying that we should have humility forced on us. We shouldn't humiliate people. What I'm saying is that an inner sense of openness, you can call it humility. An inner sense of humility is the way to go. Now I'm going to finish up with Kitcher and Mitchell commenting on Kitcher. Kitcher puts it, the community goal is to arrive at universal acceptance of the true theory. So the slogan here, Sandra says, might be pluralism, the way to unity. But these accounts of competitive pluralism lead to the judgment that pluralism is temporary and strategic, but ultimately eliminable. Hence my radical openness. While this correctly identifies some of the diversity of models and explanations found in contemporary science, it fails to capture all of it. The remainder is constituted by compatible but not mutually exclusive alternatives. So we've always recognized diversity in, say, biology, such as what Mayer talks about, distinguish between how and why questions that one may ask about nature. but the anonymity, the autonomy of separate biological traditions from a perceived threat of reductionism and elimination is a problem. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Am I still with you?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so to conclude, I would assert that science actually does reduction and uh, unification or unity and pluralistic uh, understanding or how do I get this clear? Science is doing both. It's not specifically reductionistic, but what science does have is it's fallible. And so this constant reaching out and trying to increase intelligibility is, I think, foundational, and should be the main focus of science. Uh, thank you very much, and that was a bit long, and also gets to be quite specific there at the end. So I hope that you can ask some questions and I can clarify.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hartzell, for that comprehensive input on integrative pluralism and also the nuanced perspective on complexity and interdisciplinary is indeed very crucial in today's world. So we are now open for your questions, comments, and reflections. For the participants, please don't hesitate to raise your hand or approach the mic. We encourage everyone to please ask questions. Okay, how about from MSU IIT students? Do you have questions or comments about the inputs shared this morning?
I have a question, Sweet.
Okay, sir.
That if Sir Bayod is still here, and to Dr. Hartzell and Dr. Juichiro. Um, Maybe I am not very much updated on this, but I am basing my question on my own personal assessment, my own opinion. Because I see in my own observation that um, the I believe that the indigenous uh, societies are uh, very much open to um, maybe scientific knowledge, and as well as religious faith, no, which is different from their own ethnicities or ethnic beliefs. However, I look at, on the contrary, religion as somehow very strict and restrictive, that might not be that open when it comes to, for example, um, maybe uh, questions that may challenge the conservative view of the religious faith, as well as science might also be not that open to religious faith, and might be opposed also to indigenous wisdom. My question is, how far uh, can this different um, this different um, um, this in different entities would be possible for integration, because the conservatism might be a hindrance or close-mindedness of scientists might be a hindrance to a possible integration, or might be considered as integrative pluralism.
Maybe Layne can answer that, Migs.
Yeah, actually, I thought he was speaking to you, Ryan. Can you,
I understand, but maybe you can provide
yeah,
your perspectives.
okay, Menolito, can you say that last part again for me?
Uh, in my own perception, Lane, in my, for example, in my exposure in ethnic communities in the Philippines, they are at least somehow open to um, maybe foreign uh,
Right.
foreign knowledge systems that are introduced to them. However, I do not see it as similar to how the church, for example, or maybe scientists would look at the indigenous knowledge systems.
Yeah, I got that part. That was that the last part. Yeah, I think when I'm speaking about an integral pluralism here, I'm speaking about like in the hard sciences. So I'm quoting like Philip Kitcher and all of those people. As far as like a social acceptance of this, now that's getting into like the values, right? So I could say, okay, it's factually true that there are multiple, that there's complexity in the sciences, and that I could then say there's there's brute sense data that there's a mountain there or trees there. But when we get over here and we start going into whether the church is going to accept something, and that's really up to the Vatican and how they make their decisions on what on what epistemologies they're going to accept, and also at the level of the villages with the archbishop. Now, for the actual indigenous communities that I've talked to, they've been highly interested in scientific information. For example, in the 90s, I was invited to um, but there's a women's organization called the Zapatistas, and the Zapatistas is a large indigenous group, just like you guys, you all there in southern Philippines, but they're particularly under assault from this plan Puebla, Panama, and the takeover of the biodiversity there, the Lacandon jungle there in southern Mexico and Guatemala. And so the parteras, the women who do the birthings for the communities, the tribes, they invited me to come and talk about molecular biology. Well, why would they be interested in molecular biology? Well, what happened was a University of Georgia professor had was living in the community, funded by University of Georgia, taking their biodiversity, taking the DNA from their biodiversity and putting it into the knowledge databases for, say, Monsanto Corporation. All right, now we've got a problem. So the indigenous people rose up against this. They already were in armed confrontation, okay, due to neoliberalism and that kind of thing. But based on this, there was armed confrontation between indigenous knowledge and protecting the earth, kind of like Pachamama or something in the South America, or what Rogelio was talking about with he and John's paper, that which is a really good paper, Communing with Mother Earth by Rogelio, and then the other one on technology with John are very good. So anyway, they invited me to come and speak because they won. They fought back with force against this onslaught from the biotech companies, and they won a moratorium for 2 years, like a ceasefire, to learn about DNA. I mean, fascinating, right? So they want to understand what it is that these people want from their traditional knowledge, their traditional plants and all of that. So I went there and with a number of other people, uh, lawyers and law scholars from University of Chicago were there, not with me, but we were all there at the same time, and we were all discussing with the indigenous people in what you would call council democracy or deliberative democracy, and this this was for their understanding of that particular condition. So I would say I would give that story as a response from the indigenous people because I can speak in I don't speak in their place, but I can speak about what they were doing. And then for the Catholic Church, since I'm not in the fold, I'm not a Catholic. But I can tell you that it's up to those things are up to the Pope and to the Patriarchy. And I'm going to say something quite controversial here while since we're talking about society and science and the church is that I'm actually for some versions of patriarchy at this point in history, and the reason is because what many people, there's this constant and rightfully so. The patriarchy is bad and all of this. I mean, we got it right. I mean, Europe destroyed itself over many times, 30 Years' War and all of this stuff. But the patriarchy is far better. I mean, the patriarchy the Catholic patriarchy overcame this androaggression of this Roman androaggression. I mean, a totally militarized Roman androaggression state is not something that we want. We don't want that kind of totalitarian system. So, aspects of patriarchy I think are good. For example, the Charter of the Forest, the Magna Carta. You know, the Magna Carta is still it's still with us, but the Charter of the Forest isn't. As Rogelio was saying earlier, basically he's talking about enclosure, of the commons. So let me end there with some kind of a controversial statement, and maybe not something to take up here, but people that are watching will certainly want to challenge that, and I think they should challenge what I said. But I think that we have to realize the levels of aggression that we can get in society. Personally, I would like a far better society. I argue for I argue for advanced technical bioregionalism, which is a democratic confederation, is a security structure, and biocentrism, and all of the stuff that Rogelio was talking about. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Layne Hartsell.
I wanted to just add on to uh, Ryan there that there was a question. This is more practical, that it is possible, or we think it's possible, and we're doing it now, to grow organs within pigs and other animals. So it's still an ethical question, obviously, right? I tend to think mostly vegetarian diet should be what we're eating. But then what do you do when let's say you could grow a new liver inside of a pig? I mean, that would be extraordinary to be able to do that, and it would save a tremendous amount of suffering in lives. That's just one example, like a kidney or, this kind of thing. So the wait list for a kidney or a liver or part of a liver, you can function with only part of the liver too. So the wait lists for these are growing much larger, and they will grow even more, as you know, as people get older. We have aging populations. So I just wanted to interject or add that as part of what Ryan was saying, is that this idea of cloning human beings for, say, organ harvestation is sci-fi, because the laws aren't going to permit this, and they're detective work and all of this, and investigative journalists are all watching this. We have experts watching for this kind of stuff, but it is possible somebody could set up a lab somewhere in I don't know, some lawless country and start doing this, and hopefully it would be shut down almost immediately, because if we're going to do that, why not take homeless people and take their organs? I mean, they're already here too. I mean, we could do that, but why don't we do that? So we don't. and this kind of goes to democracy, because democracy comes into a lot of this talk, is that if we have a majoritarian system, then we could all just vote to sacrifice a certain amount of people to get their organs or something. Well, it's absolutely crazy. We don't have a majoritarian system, and we shouldn't have a meritocratic system. So we don't want organ harvesters and a majoritarian system to all of a sudden vote to uh, take over and start doing these medical projects. But the scary part is that something like that could happen, and the other part is that the technologies are so powerful. So Rodeo's right by asking these moral questions, I think.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Hartzell.
Okay.
Another question is from Sir Manuel Zamora. Sir, would you like to ask your question? Please approach the mic.
Yeah, good morning to all. My first question is actually directed to Dr. Hartzell. As I have written in the chat box, we understand that in science there are knowledge systems that need to be highlighted and some need to be. There are some that needs to be sidelined. In your view, sir, of what you call integrative pluralism, what should now be the role of our public intellectuals and the university scholars?
Well, that's a really good question considering what's going on these days, right? We got this massive technology. I mean, just extraordinary in every way. Uh, Digital systems, information transferring everywhere. AI that can take 1,000,000 points on our social media and make a composite of us and know, and if we're say for a female can know whether she's pregnant before she knows because of what she's posting online. Uh, we've got technologies that can, as Ryan was saying, we can clone embryos and do stem cells and all of this kind of thing. Uh, so let me repeat your question here. It how should this be dealt with in society? What exactly how should it be dealt with in society, or what should it? I mean, are we talking about techniques or are we talking about policy?
No, I
What is your
mean, yeah, for years, the role of the university has been like a reservoir of knowledge wherein the the outside world is taken whatever advancement the university is having, and then
yeah,
now in nowadays it's the other way around. The market forces the experience of the outside world is putting weight on the kind of knowledge our students and the scholars are having.
got it.
Now what should be our role now as intellectuals and scholars?
Okay, so yeah, you mentioned the public intellectual in this. Okay, so the university came out of in fact, the university and the Catholic Church are still uh, forms of like kind of medieval guilds, right? And I'm for medieval cities, even though I argue against the megapolitron of today. The megapolitron is this, metropolis acceleration that we're getting and responsible for climate and all that. So that's another issue. But if you take like say the medieval cities, Christianopolis and this kind of thing, those weren't too bad. These kinds of guilds and you have that medieval city and I talk about Dante. They were out in the forest walking around, whereas when Tertullian was working in the fourth century, fourth century, uh, people were afraid of being outside because there's so many animals and this kind of thing. So okay, so for today, the university since von Humboldt and around 1820 has been a center for using for learning theory and putting it into application. Tremendous development, right? Tremendous development, and that culminated in the California education system, which was, probably one of the great, if not the greatest development ever in human history, the California education system, the university system. So what happened is that the state, as we started to have this nation state system that came about, Westphalia, this kind of thing, the nation state was used by, say, von Humboldt, who was a Prussian, politician too, to protect knowledge, to protect the university, the academical community, right? And so that's the model that we had up until around, I don't know, maybe 1990. We'll have to ask some scholars exactly, but around 1990, something happened. And what happened is, whereas before, like say the professors in physics were talking with the biologist, Richard Feynman was talking with all the different scientists about different things, this kind of stuff. Even when I was in undergrad, it was still pretty open, but it started to get closed down. So what happened is they started to implement policies of competitiveness between knowledge producers, and you can't have that in a if you want a decent society and if you want decent knowledge production. So what happens is you turn it was termed this. The term was professors have to be entrepreneurs, right? Now, what if I were to say to you, as theology students, your monks, the monks here, or the fathers here in this chat should be entrepreneurs. I mean, it's an offense to humanity to have the competitive mechanism relations, right? All right, so this is what happened in knowledge. So by the time of the late 1980s, the scientists were like, this is impossible to do. This is impossible. So what the scientists did, now we're talking about meritocracy, right? Because in the science, not in society, but in the scientists got together because there is this thing called the Genome Project. The scientists were so isolated from each other, they formed a collaborative system, went around this neoliberal system, and we got the human genome within 10 years. The innovation that happened so quick there in the late 20th century was incredible. But still, this relentless assault of this neoliberal system of forcing people into entrepreneurship rather than in knowledge seeking has created what I call market university, which basically gets rid of the university, because the university is about universal knowledge, comprehensive knowledge. It's about exploration of self and world, and so on. So I think that when we get to answer your question now, I don't think we should be public intellectuals. I think the public intellectual is a distortion today, in fact, a perversion today, of what people in the past who were speaking in public, say Sartre, Sartre and Davao, or Russell, Noam Chomsky, and so on. I don't think we should really have public intellectual. I think we should just speak as people who, if we have some kind of expertise, if I'm a surgeon, speak in public as a surgeon and then go home. And it's not about us. For rearranging, for dealing with the university, your other question, I think we go around the bricks and mortar structure of the university. Now, certainly, yes, the universities are there, right? What we do is we build a complementary structure, because I don't think it worth it right now to do all of the work that it would change, to do all of the work that it would take to change the university structure. It's now that it's gotten all locked up with the oligarchy and the military state and this kind of stuff. I think we do a complement to that and go around it using open source education, open source structures, which is exactly what you're doing, It's exactly what Daryl Macer is doing with AUSN and connected with the United Nations and all of that. So I had to give you some background to be able to answer your question. So get rid of the public intellectual, make a complementary system around the university. Come back at me, Manuel, if you want. Let me know.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Doc.
Okay. I believe Ma'am Julian would like to say something. Okay. All right, let's proceed. Another question is from Jamil Ali. Please approach the mic.
Hello, good morning. I'll just read my question. I want to address this question to Sir Hartzell, Sir Tanami, and Dr. Mabolok. How does the advancement of AI technologies compel a evaluation of established philosophical concepts such as consciousness, free will, and the nature of human identity, especially considering the implications of machine learning and artificial agents on our understanding of what it means to be human in a technologically mediated technology. Tech, yeah, I mean, technologically mediated world. So thank you.
Okay, so your question is, and I've heard this come up earlier that Professor Ryan answered. There, I think that young people today have heard about this kind of reality as a simulation and this kind of computational human and the the human mind. In neuroscience, the human mind is seen as a computer, like all of this kind of stuff. I think that, and I want Ryan to actually engage me with this too, because I'd like to do that here in the class, because the class allows us to go back and forth, and I think we'll agree, but I'd like to hear him respond. First of all, let me tell you that this is utter nonsense. It's being used as hype to put in a techno-utopian system that is plutocratic. So you have basically a high concentration of billionaires creating a new religion and a market structure to to hook your imaginations into this new system that's coming about. Okay. We just had the election in the United States. It's obvious. That's a totalitarian structure. It has corporations like Palantir, which is an AI surveillance system. Of course, Google's there and so on. And of course, Elon Musk is now in the US government along with Trump. So basically, you have landed capital with buildings and this kind of, these heavy structures combining with this other industrialism and rockets and all of that. And then, so what they do is they buy social media. So they buy Twitter X and make it as their broadcast platform. That's what I think is coming about. Now, to answer your question about uh, why is this system like it is? I think well, first of all, let me start with David Deutsch. One of the most respected quantum physicists around. He says reality is not computational, right? The computational systems that we have, like the tablet or even the supercomputers that they're using for the climate, uh, those are computational systems using technology, right? So we're getting data, digits and ones, and this kind of thing. But when it comes to reality, in my view, from what I see, it looks like reality is actually analog. It's not digital. But anyway, whatever we'd have to maybe you could invite David Deutsch to come in and talk about this. But if reality is not computational, and they found a way to falsify this kind of thing, the computational thing comes from Nick Bostrom, who was supported by Elon Musk at Oxford. Uh, so if reality is not computational, and we start to try to understand what's happening socially with this new structure coming in, then we say, wait a minute, okay, we're not going to be, I mean, it's total sci-fi to think that we're going to upload our consciousness into some computer somewhere. Okay. What happens is the reason that they can develop the large language models, or maybe they can develop your image on a screen, is they're using data points and these specific lines of code, and even you'll see AI kind of learn, but it's not actual human intelligence. It's not humanity. It's not even like the intelligence of, say, animals that you see, which I think have intelligence also. They do certain things. So Turing, I think, let me end in this point with Alan Turing, the great mathematician who solved some of the, I think it was the Germany code. He said in response to this question, he said, do we say that submarines can swim? Okay, so can computers think? No. Are computers conscious? No. All right. Now, if we want to have a sci-fi, highly speculative, maybe Gibson, the sci-fi writer, these guys, and Ursula, what was her name? She's dead now. But anyway, the sci-fi writers, they might want to get a hold of it and expand our ideas and all of that, which is great. I think it's great. So I want to give Ryan a chance to answer here.
Yeah, thank you, Layne. Actually, I had a chance to listen to David Chalmers in Rome, Italy, earlier this year, in August, and he discussed artificial intelligence and consciousness. Layne is correct, and I'd like to say that machines do not actually have consciousness. It's a long shot for machines to be able to think. While it's true that large language models can actually mimic neural systems and they can actually write, they lack the requisites of human consciousness, one of which is machines do not have emotions. Machines are incapable of what we call propositional logic, meaning to say they cannot actually formulate their own concepts. And given that, the basic requisites as regard to whether or not a machine can think is not there. Okay, so only human beings think. Machines make computations based on the thinking of human beings. And so we're the ones doing the thinking, we're putting the input. The only thing that machines can do is that they do not have the physical stress that the human brain experiences. But artificial intelligence does not have the kind of consciousness humans have, in so far as they cannot adapt and do not have the same experiences. And while we can input and in that regard, okay, narrow the way they do these things on the basis of whatever are put into there, and that's correct. I've read Nick Bostrom's Super Intelligence, and he actually said that machines will soon take over. Well, what I'm seeing is that figures like Elon Musk are actually the ones taking over because they're making so much money out of this. And so I concur with Layne respect to his, you know, conclusions. It's a morally weighty issue, okay? And it's not just a technical question. It's actually a question that is brought about by the advent of consumer society, capitalism, and of course, obviously, technological determinism. So, given that from a philosophical end, AI does not really change our conception of the meaning of autonomy, our views on what is moral or what is not moral. What AI can do is, of course, speed up the process of computing, but not necessarily reasoning, because AI has not provided us in any way with the solutions, for instance, to climate change. Okay, so these are things that human beings actually do when they make judgments about the world. while AI can anticipate human behavior on the basis of patterns, insofar as they mimic neural systems, AI does not have the ability to possess the moral vantage points that only human beings can have with respect to how we make judgments. For instance, AI can project the type of damage that a 2,000-pound bomb can do on a population. But ultimately, the decision will have to be done by a human being, okay? A person who is morally conscious and a person who is morally aware of the consequences to his actions.
Please open your cameras for a quick screenshot, everyone. All right. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a great morning. This has been your MC for today, Sweet Mary of C. Aviles. And thank you, everyone.